Hello everyone, welcome to the fourth lesson in Composition Fundamentals. This lesson is aimed to develop some of the skills associated with starting your very first piece. While there isn't necessarily one correct method to start that is better than others, you may find there will be one method that works best for you, or even more suited to the style and genre of the piece you aim to compose. We are first going to be exploring 4 different methods to begin a composition, and then look at some examples that use the 4 methods to get started. They work best in no particular order and often work even better when paired with more than one method. The methods we are going to be looking at are overarching form, melodic or harmonic hooks, percussion grooves, and rhythm. So with that being said, let's start. One way to begin composing a piece is to consider the bigger picture first. Ask yourself these questions. What is the big picture? How long do I want the piece to be? These questions relate back to the first lesson regarding the purpose of the piece. Perhaps the length is predetermined, or you don't want to spend months writing it and prefer to keep the length down. To add a few more advanced questions regarding the big picture and length of the piece, start to consider if any music ideas are going to return during the piece. Is there a traditional form involved? Having musical ideas return at various points of a piece is a heavily established tradition that has existed throughout music for hundreds of years. Musical theorists have identified recurring patterns of repetition and given them fancy names to help distinguish them from one another. While it isn't necessary to learn and memorize the various forms to have a successful composition, it will be very beneficial to quickly outline some of the more basic and popular categories of musical form. The most common and simple traditional form is called binary. Binary means 2, and it describes having 2 contrasting musical content, either melodic, harmonic, or an extended phrase. To visualize the form as letters, it would be expressed as A, B. If the A music content returned in your piece after the B content, it would be called ternary, meaning 3, and it would be expressed as A, B, A. When a musical idea or phrase returns, often with different material interjected between the main idea, it's called rondo form. Usually the different material will also return in the opposite order that it was presented in. The most traditional expression of this is A, B, A, C, A. There is no pre-established musical length for these letters. They could represent a few melodic notes or an extensive section of music. These forms have been tried and tested for centuries, so it's safe to use these forms with excellent results. Note that more extensive and elaborate versions of these forms exist, but they aren't required to know when you're just getting started. These ideas of form can also be applied to non-musical concepts. What emotional context do you want to hit within the piece? Is it going to start sad and then move towards happiness? Or perhaps you want to vary the emotional expression as the piece progresses. What speed or tempo do you want your piece to start at? Maybe you want to start at a fast speed, but then transition to slow and then back to fast. We can use the 3 traditional forms we listed above as the building blocks on which you can start to jot down your musical ideas on top of. Most compositions start by thinking about form and the direction they want the piece to take. Let's take a look at the 3rd movement of the String Quintet in E major by Boccherini. Examining the entire movement, it starts with an A section, then moves to a B section, and finally returns to the start once more before ending. The form is therefore ternary, A, B, A. If we zoom in and examine just the beginning A section, it becomes clear that this smaller section has its own internal form. 2 repeated A sections and 2 repeated B sections. A, B, or binary form. We can zoom in even further and only focus on the first half, and it's clear that there are 2 phrases or sections within this bit as well. Learning the basics of form is like learning how to build a house. To start with a house, you first need to build the foundation and frame it. In a very basic sense, once you've built the supporting beams, you are able to shift your focus to decorating and attaching fancy fixtures to it. The same applies in music. All the more interesting musical materials are able to be attached and supported within the bigger structure that was built ahead of time. The second method we want to look at is the melodic and harmonic hook. Many genres of music are focused around a short melodic phrase that is repeated and developed as the piece goes on. The hook element doesn't necessarily have to be in the melody. It can also be in the bass or another supporting instrument. Some general rules for hooks are as such. Most hooks have direction. They start in one place and end in another place. These types of hooks feel like they are moving forward in direction. Other types of hooks go on a journey and then return to the same starting position. Most hooks contain smaller intervals rather than larger intervals. If you want to use larger intervals, make sure to precede the large jumps with consecutive smaller intervals. That is, intervals less than a fourth. Most hooks stay in a tonal center. You can either have a modal center or a tonal center. Modal centers are a group of notes that stay within a certain mode versus tonal centers which stay within a certain key. Most hooks have rhythms that vary. Use of a variety of quarter, eighth, and syncopated rhythms give the hook life. Static rhythmic phrases are generally more dull than hooks with rhythmic variety. Keep in mind, these are just general rules and there are always exceptions to any rule. I would also recommend starting with a melodic hook rather than a harmonic hook, due to the fact that harmony is much easier to mold around your hook than vice versa. In this example, Michael Jackson started his piece with a melodic hook in the bass. This hook conforms to the rules outlined before. The hook has direction, straying melodically from the center of B flat before returning through an ascending and descending motion. The hook also contains more smaller intervals than larger ones, and the large ones are surrounded by smaller intervals. The rhythms vary, and the hook stays within the tonal center. The next example is from a video game that I wrote music for. The melodic hook is heard multiple times at the start and forms the basis for the remaining melodic lines. The larger intervals are contrasted with smaller intervals, staying in one tonal center and has direction that returns to the start. Unlike the first example, this hook has minimal rhythmic variety. Does that make it a bad hook? Not necessarily. It still seems pretty catchy to me, but perhaps it could be improved with some rhythmic variety. Some types of music are built more strongly around the percussive groove of the piece than the melodic or harmonic content. Starting a piece with a percussion groove is very useful for epic orchestral, tribal, EDM, or funk genres of music. As little as 4 bars is often enough to get an established feeling or groove going for the rest of the piece and can help speed along the entire compositional progress. There are various percussive elements available to help with the groove, including drums and pitch percussion, marimbas, steel drums, pianos, etc. One thing to note for starting a piece with a percussive groove is that it's much harder to start this way on manuscript or digital score, as feeling the groove is easier to do when you can hear it. If your music calls to be started with this method, make sure you are prepared to start with samples ready in your DAW of choice. This piece, again by Michael Jackson, starts with the percussion groove. Whether or not the groove was established before everything else is hard to say, but we can use this as an example that using a percussion groove to start your piece is a plausible method that various artists have used themselves. The final method I want to share with you is using rhythm. This method differs from a melodic hook or percussion groove as you can use it to write a small section or even the entire piece if you want. It's very useful if you are struggling to start a piece or figure out a melodic hook or percussion groove. To use this method, start by marking in the rhythms you want to use and follow somewhat of a pitch range you envision the final notes to be. This doesn't have to be perfect, but should show the intended rhythm and contour of the line. Clusters of notes to represent chords or harmony are okay. Once the rhythms are locked in and you're happy with it, begin replacing the notes with your desired melody or harmony. It's going to be slightly harder to start this way on a DAW, as often how you play in the rhythm will be harder to decipher unless you are using perfect quantizing or manually drawing the notes in by hand. I use this method to start this orchestral piece. Notice the rough sketching in of notes as I decided the rhythms first. But when comparing it to the final sketch, the rhythms are more or less the same, and it helped me refine the notes and better replicate the idea I had in my head. I hope these 4 different methods will help you as you begin your next composition. One of them may work better for you than the other 3, so make sure you consider your own compositional strengths and the genre of piece you plan to compose to utilize these methods to maximum efficiency. Your assignment for this lesson is to practice each of these methods for your own piece. Answer the questions posed for method number 1 and come up with a visual diagram or graph that encompasses those ideas you've decided on. Try developing your own short musical hook based on the second method. If you have trouble with number 2, try developing your own percussion groove and then see if you can come up with a melodic idea that will work with it. And finally, use method number 4 to add a counterpoint line or continue with a new melodic phrase for the next few bars by using that method.